Okay.
Rehman Chishti.
Thank you, Chairman. Can I just follow up on the question in relation to students from my colleague Tim Loughton? When we talk about ensuring that we bring in the brightest and the best to our great, wonderful country, some then say that the system that we have at the moment, for example, if one speaks to Bishop Michael Nasir Ali, the former Bishop of Rochester, and now who's at the Centre of Oxford looking at teaching theology, and they say the way the system is designed at the moment, it ensures that if you've got money and you have to show money in your accounts before you can then come and study over here, then that prevents those who might be the best and the ablest, but they don't have the means to demonstrate that they can stay in the United Kingdom. So the way the process is applied deters some of the brightest and the best because they may not be from an affluent background. Do you get those concerns raised with you or not?
A bit, but I mean, if you're talking about international students, I mean, I think we'd expect international students to come here to have some way of supporting themselves while they're here. I mean, it might be through a scholarship or financial aid from a UK institution to attract the best and the brightest. But I don't think it's unreasonable to think that there's a certain level of financial resources to have assurance that people can have enough money to live on as well as pay the fees while they're here.
Totally understand the point you raised, and my point was, by virtue of clarification, to say, is that something which has been raised? Because if it has, then one would then need to look at future modelling to address some of those concerns when moving forward in how we set this.
I mean, I wouldn't have said that that it's one of the things that came up most, frequently.
Okay.
I mean, but I think probably it has been mentioned, but not very often.
And just looking at the post-Brexit migration strategy, and coming to you, Ms. Sumpton, the Migration Observatory has noted that it is important to understand the current picture of low-skilled migration coming in from the UK in order to look at setting the strategy moving forward. However, at the same time, it says it's very difficult to get a reliable picture to come to the correct conclusion. So how do you come to the correct conclusion?
So if you're talking about the data gaps, I think this is a really significant issue. When you're trying to look at the skill composition of the flow of people to the UK, it's essentially impossible. We have data on people who are here, so we know a fair amount about the jobs that people are doing, at least if they're here long-term enough to make it into the labour force survey and so forth. We then have data on flows of people coming in and out, but there's no occupational or employment information about them, partly because it's not in the questions, but also obviously a lot of people don't necessarily have a job when they're doing that, which means that we don't have basic information, for example, of what is the annual number of people entering the UK and working, say, in the hospitality industry or in a low-skilled job. I think is something that there could in principle be some data on that in the future. We have, if you're looking at administrative data sources, which the ONS is currently doing, but still in kind of early stages of development, people, we have information on the nationalities of people as they come in. You can look at who's a new arrival, what kind of jobs they're doing, and that would, I think, make it a lot easier to do that kind of modelling. I think if we're looking at the system going forward, one of the really big questions is how are we going to be able to evaluate, let's say there are big changes in the immigration system, are we going to know what the impacts were? And currently there are some really big deficiencies in the data that will make that quite hard.
Yeah. And can I just say a clarification in relation to moving forward? I think it's always good to learn from where mistakes have been made to ensure you get it right in the future. From what you see at the moment, is the government looking at and asking those questions to ensure that where there is that deficit, from what you say there is a deficit in relation to information, which is now meaning that you can't get a reliable picture to set the correct strategy, are they asking the right questions to ensure that the future strategy then can get the information which needs to be got?
So I can't speak exactly for the government's plans. I don't know exactly
what they're doing. No, but I'm asking you as not the government. Sorry, can I just ask? I'm not asking you to speak for the government.
Yes, no.
I'm saying in relation to us independently looking at the information that you have, you are far better equipped at having that information than, say, for example, I have, because it's not my expertise, but I'm asking you, as an independent observer looking at this, are the government asking those questions to ensure that they get the right information to set the correct strategy?
I have some concerns about the availability of data in the future that would be needed to evaluate the system. So, for example, let's say we're going to expand the youth mobility scheme. This is something the government has said that they want to do in the Brexit white paper. Now, when the MAC looked at teacher shortages a couple of years ago, one of the interesting things that came out of this report, this was a report about Tier 2 in the shortage list, one of the interesting things that came out about that was that actually recruitment companies were saying, oh, teachers are mostly using Tier 5, they're not using Tier 2. But there was basically no information on what people on Tier 5 visas are doing. if we're going to evaluate a possible expansion of the youth mobility scheme, a basic piece of information you might want to know is what people are doing. And it is in principle possible to have that information if you do what, for example, Canada does, which is linking up tax records to immigration records and following people who come in on different routes.
Yeah.
The other big area where I think there's an issue in the future is a settled status scheme. That it is possible that we, in a few years' time, when the scheme has been implemented, we won't really have any idea how inclusive it's been and whether there are significant numbers of people who fall through the gaps. Administrative data is part of that, but we could be doing things like, for example, collecting survey data. Again, this is something that Australia does, for example. In their survey data, they ask people what type of visa they're on, and that would enable you to work out things like, do people have settled status? What are the characteristics of people who don't? I'm not aware of any plans in place to try and do that kind of thing. I do think it would be quite helpful if we're serious about trying to evaluate these policies.
Yeah, and just clarification on that, in terms of concerns about availability of data, is that because sometimes one does not want to ask the question because they may not like the answer they get, or is it genuinely too complex an issue to get to grasp of, or how does one deal with that?
It is not impossible to have data on these things. Other countries do it. Some of it requires a significant amount of development, and as I mentioned, the Office of National Statistics is working on trying to make better use of administrative data, but it's a slow process. I think with a lot of these things, it's a question of how much priority is put on making sure that the data sources are there. If we really wanted those data sources to be in place, I suspect it could be made to happen.
Can I just clarify one thing? You mentioned the settled status point, and that's in relation to joining a family member over here. Am I right in saying that?
Sorry, I mean, this is for EU citizens who are already living in the UK and who will need some kind of documentation to stay here legally after Brexit. And
the reason I say that, just a clarification, just wider from the mark, the point that was raised with me, catching a flight from Chicago last night to London this morning, by the passenger next to me, who was a US citizen, is now married to a British national living in Hampshire, both qualified, both well skilled. The husband is a British national, has a small firm, and they pay themselves in dividends rather than income, and therefore the time it takes, they pay their taxes and dues for them to come over here. Has there been concerns in relation to how the incomes is calculated, which then may deter or delay legitimate applicants to come to this country?
So if you're talking about how income is measured, I assume you're talking about how income is measured for the purposes of meeting the minimum income requirement. This is something that stakeholders raise a fair amount, that it's more difficult for self-employed people to demonstrate that. I'm not aware of any in-depth research that's been done on it.
And so you would say that is an area where it needs to be looked at?
Yes, yeah.
So I just want to be clear, Madam Chairman, that Liz, who I met from Iowa last night on the plane from Chicago to London, who sat next to me after 2 hours sleep because the first flight got cancelled, that I did raise the point, and she'll be sending me the email, which I'll forward to you. But it's as members of Parliament, we do travel and we do hear what people have to say. But it was raised with me. But
I love her seat allocation.
She's not even my constituent in Hampshire, I'm in Kent, but. Yeah, very good. But it is a point where people do raise it in terms of where they do the right thing, but it's how calculations are made. And if there's a better way of doing that, I think that works all around.
There are a number of questions that have been raised about how income is calculated, whether self-employment or the fact, for example, that spousal income doesn't count towards the threshold when people are coming into the country. That whole package of measures is something, certainly that comes up a lot.
Yeah, and can I just ask a question to you, Professor Manning, in relation to UK's median annual salary, just in relation to Tier 2, what is the current UK's annual median salary?
So the median annual full-time salaries, the latest available figures are actually April 2017, is 28,746, I believe. So if you uprate that to what it would be today, it'd be about 30,000.
And that is if the economy continues to improve, and if it doesn't...
Well, no, this is what would have happened over the past 18 months. I know that it's been reported...
Overestimating the wage inflation that's happened in the last 12 months.
No, over 18 months, if we say 4%... I mean, the current median is 4%, a bit over 4% below the actual median, so I think 4% wage growth over 18 months is not so... I mean, it's there or thereabouts, I think it would be fair to say.
Because the point I raised on that, and I think you touched on earlier when you mentioned the point about doctors, about a route which may be able to then assist those professionals, but teachers and healthcare professionals, when the threshold is at 30 and currently looking at 28. Every penny counts and every pound matters. You still don't have a challenge in relation to addressing the threshold for those key sectors which we need in our economy and society, don't we?
Well, teachers and doctors are already within the tier two system, meeting those salary thresholds. So, I mean, I think people sometimes forget about the entrant rate. So, the bottom of the teacher pay scale, for example, is above the minimum entrance salary, and then over a certain number of normal years, a teacher would end up above 30,000. So, even if you take primary school teachers, you've got median earnings of 35,000. So, I mean, I think I think our view, and I know it's not always been reported in this way, is that the salary thresholds are not so unreasonable.
Would I be right in saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're saying that there will be no risk at all that the threshold will be too difficult to meet for workers in professions such as teaching and healthcare?
I'm not saying no risk would be a very strong...
So where would you say the risk is? High, low or medium?
Well, I think there's basically what happens at the moment, there's a new entrant salary, which is 20,800, and then there's a sort of a jump to 30,000. So I think there's some issues about whether that jump is a little bit too steep, whether you want to smooth it out. But at the whole time, you also want to keep the system as simple as possible. You don't want to... One of the big complaints about the system is it's very complicated to understand. So, I mean, I think... I think it's not unreasonable if you have a migrant who comes in earning below median earnings, they're driving down the average wages of people in the UK. They're making the UK a little bit a lower wage economy. And the question is really, is that the way that we want the UK? That's not really our vision for what we want the UK to be. If you look at, for example, the government's industrial strategy, or even every previous government's sort of industrial strategy.
I think the question is, we all want to ensure that you get the brightest and the best and create a fair system, and therefore you have to ask those questions, is a fair system being created? And therefore one asks those questions. Let's ask a final question, if I may, to Ms. Sumpton. How great is the risk that the change is intended to control lower skilled migration, i.e. employer sponsorship of workers, will also discourage skilled migration?
That one's to me?
Yeah.
Yes, I think that is a risk. The MAC report mentions some ways of making it easier on the high-skilled end for Tier 2, so on the labour market test, for example, and the CAB. It then, I think in more general terms, says the government needs to take seriously the concerns about how difficult it is for people to get through the sponsor licensing system. Although, there's a whole area of inquiry. I think that would be a whole other report in itself to look at exactly how that could be done. Overall, if you look across the world, especially, for example, when you think about small businesses, it is widely recognised that some employers find it difficult to get through a work permit system, regardless of what kind, not just the UK system, whatever system you have. It's always more difficult for small businesses than for large businesses, and that's because of lack of capacity. It's not a surprise, probably, that when you look at the current Tier 2 system, it's mostly large businesses that are using that system. So I think in 2017, around 70% of the people sponsored for Tier 2 visas were going to companies with over 250 employees. So yes, I do think that's an issue. Empirically, it is very difficult to predict exactly what those impacts will be, and obviously it depends on how the policy is implemented and whether there is an effort to try and make it easier for businesses to use.